Paige Prentice is a wildlife biologist and outdoor enthusiast. She grew up in the pine forests of the Sierra Nevada mountains and obtained her undergraduate degrees from the University of California, Santa Cruz. After graduating, Paige discovered her love for the desert and moved to the small town of Bishop, California. In 2015, she was hired as the lead desert bighorn sheep biologist for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. During her 6 years with CDFW, she monitored and managed over 50 mountain ranges with bighorn sheep. Paige is currently pursuing a Master of Science degree at Oregon State University. Her thesis, not surprisingly, is focused on desert bighorn. So Paige, you can take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Alima. And thank you, Envirothon, for hosting me or inviting me to come and talk today. Let's get my presentation going. And can y'all see that slide all right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me get just sorted here. Okay, great. So hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And again, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to be here. As you just heard, my name is Paige. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I'm going to be presenting on Ain't No Mountain High Enough to Keep Bighorn Sheep from Facing Climate Change. Hopefully a couple of you get the reference. If not, we're just dating ourselves. I'm going to start with just a quick outline before I dive into the presentation. So my understanding is that the theme for Envirothon this year is adapting to climate change, and we're going to speak about that in regards to desert bighorn sheep. But first, I'm going to start with just an introduction to give you a little bit more information about myself and how I came to be speaking here with you today. As high school students, I know many of you are probably thinking about college and are probably often asked what you want to be when you grow up. I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert, but I'm here to let you know that it's okay if you don't know what you want to be when you grow up. And I'll talk a little bit about my background. After I go over my background, I will talk about our focus for today, bighorn sheep, a little bit of background on them, their habitats, specific adaptations that allow them to thrive, how climate change is affecting them, some management tools and ways that managers are working to mitigate these impacts, and how specifically state and federal agencies, some of the details about like the tools that they use and that we're able to put forth for management. Sorry about that. There will be a question and answer period at the end. But since we're a smaller group today, I encourage you that if you have questions while I'm speaking, feel free to use the raise the hand button or type the question in the chat, and Alima or Anna can interrupt me and let me know, and we can clarify any questions you might have. So a little bit more, who am I? I'm 32 years old. I grew up in the Sierra Nevada mountains in a little town called Nevada City. As you heard, I went to UC Santa Cruz for undergrad, go Slugs. I double majored with a Bachelor's of Science in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and a Bachelor's of Arts in Anthropology. After graduating, I studied orangutans on the Borneo island of Indonesia. And from there, I went and worked in Death Valley National Park for about 6 months, and that's where I fell in love with the desert. And it was after working in Death Valley that I got a job working for CDFW. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But just some fun facts about me. I do love the desert. I love to hike and mountain bike and kite surf. I have a dog named Yuba. You can see her in the photo there. And I'm really passionate about trying to make the world a better place, and specifically on topics around climate change. So I'm excited to be able to be here and share that passion with y'all today. As a wildlife biologist for Cal Fish and Wildlife, I was in charge of monitoring over 50 mountain ranges. This included doing capture efforts and surveys. Surveys would be done on the ground or in helicopters. I had a team of 4 to 5 people that would help me go out into the field, get eyes on bighorn sheep, do mortality recoveries when animals died, track how many lambs there were, overall population health, and I'll get into a little bit more of that later. While I was working for Cal Fish and Wildlife, I did start a master's at Oregon State University. I'm currently pursuing it, and its focus is wildlife science. Again, for my master's, I am focused on desert bighorn sheep, and a lot of my work for my research was tracking bighorn sheep in the field. On this photo, you can see a group of bighorn sheep through a spotting scope. The little arrow there is I was watching for them to poop so that we could collect their feces, because from feces you can get really important information like diet quality. You can identify an individual based off genetic material. You can check for parasites. And so I'd sit there, find a group, watch them until they pooped, and then have to walk across the mountains to figure out where this tiny little pile was. And then I would collect it. And those samples were brought back to Oregon State and are being processed for various types of data collection. So without further ado, though, let's talk about bighorn sheep. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of seeing a bighorn sheep in real life. I hope you have. They can be very hard to find. They are well adapted to their environment. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I just want to do a couple basics for those of you that aren't familiar with bighorn sheep. So females are called ewes. You can see this picture on the left is a female. I think you can see my, let's see, my cursor. Hopefully you can see my cursor. So this is a female bighorn sheep called ewe. This is a lamb down here. And then you have rams that have both sexes have horns. Rams have very large horns and they can come to this full curl that you see here. Ewe horns tend to be much smaller. And the difference between horns and antlers, for folks that aren't familiar, is horns they're born with and grow for the duration of their life and stay on their head the whole time, whereas antlers, if you think of deer, fall off every year and then they have to regrow them. So that's just a differentiation when people are talking about horns or antlers that's important. So in terms of wild sheep, there are wild sheep throughout Western North America. There are both thin-horn sheep and bighorn sheep. For the purpose of this talk, we're focusing on bighorn sheep, but I wanted you to just know that there are 3 subspecies. And the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep are the only ones that are not in California. We'll get there in just a minute. But basically, sheep are found throughout the West. They used to be in much larger numbers and bigger populations than they currently are as there was Western expansion in the 1800s. Western colonizers brought with them a lot of domestic livestock. Those domestic livestock had various diseases, and it's thought that that is one of the main reasons that populations of bighorn sheep declined across the West, was exposure to diseases that they did not have any immunity to. But over the last 40 years, wildlife managers have worked together to protect, maintain, and reintroduce sheep populations throughout the West. And this is a graphic of recent graphic of current populations of bighorn sheep. Within California, there are 2 subspecies. We have, let me get my cursor back again. So the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep are located in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. They are their own subspecies, and they are federally listed endangered and managed under their own recovery plan. The rest of the bighorn sheep in California are called desert bighorn sheep, Ovis canadensis nelsoni. But within these desert bighorn sheep, we have what we call a distinct population segment. I'm going to refer to them as the peninsular bighorn sheep. They're down in the peninsular ranges east of San Diego over here, Salton Sea over here. And this population is isolated from the rest of the population of desert bighorn and is also listed as endangered. And they're managed under their own recovery plan. So for the purpose of this talk today, we are going to be focusing on the non-endangered metapopulation of desert bighorn. And before I dive into climate change and how it is currently and will continue to affect desert bighorn sheep, I think it's important to gain a better understanding of just desert bighorn populations, how they're connected, the habitat that they live in. And so in order to do that, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page about a few key terms. So on the last slide, I brought up the term metapopulation. What is a metapopulation? It can be applied to various species, but for desert bighorn sheep and today's discussion, it refers to a group of populations that are spatially separated. So you can see on the map here, we have the black polygons are different mountain ranges. And for the purpose of today's talk, we're calling them different populations. So they're spatially separated, but there is some level of connectivity between them through immigration and emigration. Emigration is when an individual starts in one population and then moves to the next and stays there. And then once they emigrate out of their home mountain range, they are then an immigrant of moving into the new population. This is generally a permanent movement. A term that we use for bighorn sheep movements is more of a temporary or exploratory movement between populations and could be going between, say, North Bristol's and the Cadies. And then gene flow is the introduction of genetic material from one population to another. So that requires a mating event. To kind of tie this together, I want to just give an example that if a ram were to move from, say, the Marble Mountains over to the South Bristol Mountains, it will have immigrated from the Marbles into the South Bristols. It would have immigrated into the South Bristols. If it were to stay there and mate with a South Bristol ewe, then we would have gene flow. But if it were to move over there and then go back to the Marbles, then that would be maybe a foray move. We would call that a foray movement. And forays generally don't result in gene flow unless they happen to be right during breeding season. But forays can be important when thinking about disease because an individual can go from one population to another and back again. And if they're sick or if there's individuals that are sick in the other population and they mingle, then disease could get spread between these different mountain ranges. I'm going to pause there for a moment and just ask if anybody has questions on these general terms. Okay. So for the remainder of this talk, like I said, we're going to focus on the non-endangered portion of the desert bighorn in California. Our northernmost population of desert bighorn sheep in California is in the White Mountains up here, just outside of Bishop, California. And the southernmost goes all the way down to the border with Mexico. And there is actual movement between sheep across country lines. And they're distributed across three main desert types. So you have the Great Basin Desert up in this northern area, coming into the Mojave Desert, and then the Sonoran Desert down in the southern end. Each desert ecosystem has different characteristics to it. I'm not going to go too much into it right now, but just know that bighorn sheep are specialists in a wide variety of desert habitats, and in the White Mountains they can be all the way up at 14,000 feet in elevation, and then in Death Valley, which this is Death Valley down here, we have bighorn sheep that are below sea level. So what are some important habitat characteristics? What do all these different mountain ranges kind of have in common? Why are there desert bighorn sheep there? So a really critical piece to desert bighorn habitat is proximity to steep, rugged, rocky, open terrain. We often call this escape terrain because bighorn sheep are prey animals, and they're very visually oriented. It's important for them to be able to see long distances to help avoid predators. And it's important for them to be close to steep, rocky terrain because they've adapted to move through this terrain very, very quickly. And so if there's a predator, then they can just outrun them by moving up through the rocks in the mountains. And in part, because of this, it is also a really important habitat for them to lamb and for their offspring to be protected in that as well. Bighorn sheep also need reliable surface water. They need quality forage. And there needs to be some level of connectivity between populations so that we have that gene flow and that populations don't become too isolated. I've referenced desert bighorn sheep adaptations. I'm going to cover just a few of them. As I was talking about them moving through escape terrain, their hooves are split, and they're large and split and flexible so that they can have balance and walk on really narrow ledges, and allows them to move through the habitat very quickly. Compared to some of the other subspecies of bighorn sheep, desert bighorn sheep have a reduced body size. This helps them be more efficient in conserving energy and water. Similarly, their fur, they have a thick coat of fur, and that helps insulate them from some of the heat. And a lot of their adaptations in the desert are around water conservation. So the Mojave Desert is one of the hottest and driest places on the planet. And in order to be able to survive, they've got some really neat physiological adaptations, such as their large lungs and extensive, it's called nasal turbinate structure. If you were to look at a bighorn sheep skull, you could see it more clearly. But it allows them to be more efficient in breathing in air and conserving water when they're breathing in and out, because the desert is so dry. And their kidneys are a lot larger, which helps them be more efficient at processing water. And so their urine is very concentrated. And then a higher concentration of red blood cells. Again, it helps them conserve water by being more efficient at uptaking oxygen. And then there's behavioral adaptations such as crepuscular cycles, especially during the summer months. You can see in this bottom photo a bighorn sheep laying in the shade. That photo is taken in the middle of the day. And so during especially the peak summer months when it's hot, bighorn sheep will often be awake in the early hours of the morning and later in the evening to try and avoid that peak heat. And so when we're like out surveying, in the mornings, they're generally out and foraging and walking around. But in the afternoons when we're out there, we often are looking specifically in shady spots because they're generally bedded down and taking a break and having a little siesta while it's hot outside.
Hey, Paige.
Yeah.
I just want to ask a quick question about those summer temperatures. What are some of the ranges that they can get up to? I know some desert systems might get hotter than others, but generally,
Yeah.
What are they hunkered down in the shade, enduring in the summer heat?
Great question. So in these lower elevation mountain ranges, you can get temperatures that are over 120 degrees, and sometimes hotter. But I've regularly been doing field work in the Mojave Desert when it is over 110 degrees in the summertime, which is really hot. And thankfully it's dry heat and not not like East Coast heat with humidity. But these temperatures are extremely high. And because of that, these different mountain ranges that I've been talking about vary in elevation, they vary in exposure to heat, and different populations have adapted to their mountain ranges in various specific ways. So further north, at the higher elevations, you can get more extreme winters. So like the White Mountains often get snow in the wintertime. And bighorn sheep will come down to lower elevation in the winter. Because of the high elevation and snow, it makes the lambing period and the breeding period a lot shorter, because it's important for ewes to give birth at like peak green up so that a lamb can be born and have a lot of food to eat. And so what you see in these higher elevation ranges is a shorter lambing period. They also get milder summer temperatures. So again, in the White Mountains, which is kind of our most extreme example, they can go up to 14,000 feet in the summertime. And so the temperatures are in the 60s and 70s and much cooler. But in these lower elevation mountains, and these tend to be more of what you see around the Mojave Preserve, through Joshua Tree, Death Valley area, you have much milder winters. So you're not generally seeing snow unless you're in Southern California this last week and there was snow. But you're generally not getting snow. More precipitation is happening in the winter, but there's not as much of it. And because the desert responds quickly to precipitation events, when the green up or like when vegetation grows, can be more distributed or less predictable, is another way of thinking about it. And so the result of that is you get these longer lambing periods, and that also means longer breeding periods. But you also get these more extreme summers. And to Alima's question, they can be well over 100 degrees starting in May and go through May, June, July, August, September. And during that time, often there's not much vegetation or as much vegetation. And surface water becomes really important. Bighorn sheep are able to get a lot of, part of their adaptations is they are able to get a lot of the water that they need through the forage that they eat. And in, say, October through April, if it stays relatively cool and there's enough to eat, bighorn sheep don't necessarily even have to drink from surface water. But in these summer months, and especially as the forage dries up, it's really important that they have access to surface water. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about different types of surface water here in a few slides. Any other questions in general about kind of the habitat and where bighorn sheep are, or what they, how they adapt to their environment before I dive into climate change and how that's going to impact bighorn sheep?
This is Javira. I have a question about who are their main predators in these various regions, and whether mountains or desert? I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. So mountain lions are the main one, but especially in the desert mountain ranges, mountain lions are much more prevalent where there are also other species of prey such as deer. So like in the Sierra Nevada mountains, you get a higher density of mountain lions. In the desert, they are prevalent, but not as common. For lambs, predators could also be coyotes, golden eagles, bobcats. The predation risk in the desert is not extremely high. If you can survive being a lamb into adulthood as a bighorn sheep, your chance of survival is actually quite high to live to an older age. Rams tend to live 10 to 12 years. Females will tend to live 12 to 15 years. Disease is honestly a bigger threat to adult bighorn sheep and also to lambs as well. And then you'll occasionally get vehicle strikes, and very rarely, thankfully, poaching's not, but occasionally you'll get that. And yeah, any other questions on kind of desert bighorn sheep biology? We can circle back to it in a little bit too. What I'd kind of like to switch gears on now and kind of tying this together a bit is what climate change is currently looking like and will look like in the California deserts. And a lot of these are things you could probably predict. So increased temperatures, changes in the precipitation patterns. So typically in the Mojave Desert, for example, winter tends to be when there is the most rainfall, and it tends to come in slower rain events. So multiple days, lighter rain. So it kind of has a chance to hit the soil and percolate in. And it tends to be more widespread. So a storm will move across the desert and all the mountain ranges will get water. Whereas in the summer months, we often see summer monsoons, and monsoons tend to be isolated events that dump a lot of water out all at once. And it is often not as effective for getting water into the ground because water all falls out at once and then it moves across the surface really quickly. And so it doesn't really get to percolate in the same way. Both precipitation events are important and play a role in the desert. But what we're seeing is we're seeing less rain in the wintertime. We're also seeing less predictable monsoons. And some mountain ranges we've had go 2 or 3 years now without seeing any water. And so that obviously leads to increased drought. And in the long term, we're starting to see shifts in vegetation structure and distribution. So if these trends continue, plants that are in lower, hotter, drier areas might start shifting their distribution higher up. And so what are the impacts of that to desert bighorn? There's potential for increased habitat loss and fragmentation. We've been talking a lot about these different island-like mountain ranges, how some of them are lower elevation, some of them are higher elevation. And as I was just saying, if these lower, drier ranges are getting hotter and having less vegetation, bighorn sheep don't necessarily have a place to go. They can move up in elevation, but once you're at the top of the mountain, there's no place else to go. So if the top of the mountain's also getting affected, or if the amount of vegetation shrinks so much that it can't sustain a whole population, then you're losing habitat there. You could get, as I've been talking about, the precipitation and the forage. If you get a mismatch in when the green up happens versus when your lambs are born, then you could lose lambs, pardon me. If you get a mismatch, then the lambs won't have food to eat when they're born and won't survive. And that's something that we have documented multiple times in mountain ranges, where it's pretty common that if you have a really bad drought year, your lamb survival is close to zero. And that's okay if it happens every once in a while, but if it happens regularly, then you don't have lambs that are growing up And so you don't have as many adults. And so then your population gets smaller, and that becomes at risk for populations going extinct. Similarly, less reliable and more ephemeral water sources. So ephemeral, if you're not familiar with that term, means that it does not exist year round, and it is present or available after a rain, but then once it heats up, it might dry out. And so this constant increase in temperature also increases heat stress. As animals get more stressed, they have less resources to like internal energy resources to help them thermoregulate, which is like maintain their body temperature. And they also have less energy and resources internally to help maintain robust immune systems. And so these are kind of what I'm getting at, is these compounding effects. Like any of them by themselves might not be a big issue for bighorn sheep, but when you start getting compounding effects of all of these things happening at once, then you can start having decreased adult survival, decreased lamb survival, population declines. And there's been studies that have actually shown that, in fact, populations in lower, hotter and drier mountain ranges are much more likely to go extinct. Research done by Dr. Clint Epps up at Oregon State University, also happens to be my advisor up there. He's shown that if you are that the mountain ranges that have higher elevation, as I've been talking about, can be genetic refugia, in that they are buffered more from climate change, because sheep can go higher in elevation when it's hot out. Vegetation survives better. Some of the higher mountain ranges get more rainfall, but they're not protected from climate change. They are also still experiencing the impacts. And a study by Blake and his colleagues showed that these altered vegetation patterns and the reduced water availability could actually reduce suitable habitat by 30 to 40% by the end of this century. And then again, reiterating, and studies have shown that this heat stress results in reduced ability to gain weight, decreased reproduction, and overall increased mortality. And so I've been talking a bit about water sources and these different slides previously, and I want to just kind of show some visuals of what water looks like in the desert. You can see it can look pretty different and vary quite a bit. This one up here is a natural spring that has been augmented, and which means that cement was poured to kind of help collect water and hold water there. There's this one on the upper right is again a trough that was made out of cement and has a pipe coming down from a spring up above, and that fills it. Both of these sources tend to go dry, along with the bottom right one, which is just kind of a seep in some rocks. These tend to all go dry in the summertime once it gets really hot. There's also artificial water developments, which I'll talk about a little bit more in just a minute, but those have been used by managers to collect water and store it for the summer months. And this talk is very bighorn sheep focused, but it's just, I just want to remind folks that it's not just bighorn sheep that are living in the desert. There's golden eagles, foxes, here's some mountain lions, bobcats, owls, and all these critters also rely on water and are impacted by climate change as well. So what are our options? What can we do as managers to help mitigate these impacts? And one of the main ones is water management, and maintaining water sources. Alima and I have actually worked together on various projects in past years. This photo here is of a helicopter actually flying water into water sources because we have had extreme droughts and the water sources haven't been collecting water in the ways that they're supposed to. But because bighorn sheep rely on these water sources, as managers, it's our responsibility to continue to maintain them, which means sometimes flying water to them with helicopters. But as managers, what we're focused on is conserving our genetic diversity. Research has shown that populations that are more genetically diverse are more resilient to things like disease. And if we can keep our populations healthy, then that gives them more internal resources to help weather the longer droughts or poor food availability. In order to keep genetic diversity, it's important to protect and restore critical habitat and maintain key corridors. So that's back to the metapopulation that we were talking about and making sure that there's movement between the ability for animals to move between different mountain ranges. And I'll talk a little bit more about that research here in just a minute. And really monitoring for disease and overall population health. And we kind of put that in a package of like practicing what we call adaptive management. And that just means that we don't know exactly how climate change is going to impact populations of animals, whether it's bighorn sheep or any other population of animals. We have predictions. We can see what's currently happening, but we don't have a crystal ball to know exactly how it's going to play out. And so it's important as managers that we are paying attention, continuing to monitor, and changing our approaches and techniques as needed in order to protect and conserve these important species. And so some of the ways that we do that are by capturing and collaring animals. A lot of my work as a biologist at CDFW was running and organizing and executing helicopter captures. And what we do is we have the helicopter, here's in the middle, and the back doors are off of the helicopter, and you have people that sit in the helicopter with a net gun, so a gun that shoots a net, and the helicopter will fly around, look for animals, and then go fly next to them, and the guy in the back seat will shoot a net that comes over and captures the animal, and then they put blindfolds on them and tie we call it hobble, but tie their feet together, and then put them in a bag and fly them into camp. And the blindfolds really help because they're visually oriented animals to just kind of calm them down a little bit. And their legs are tied together to keep them safe, so they don't try to run away. It keeps us safe as well. And we then bring them into camp and collect various types of data. So we first weigh them. That's the photo that you see on the left there. And then we take a bunch of different types of measurements. So we'll measure their horn length and their girth, which is like the diameter around their chest, and their total body length. And that gives us the ability to see like change differences in populations. That has allowed us to look at how like bighorn sheep in some of the higher mountain ranges tend to actually be bigger than bighorn sheep in some of the lower mountain ranges. And that's because they have more access to good quality forage. We also take blood samples, which can be used for genetics and disease testing. We do nasal swabs also for disease testing. I'm sure many of you have had a nasal swab in the last couple of years for COVID testing. It's similar. And we'll take feces, again, that also can be used for genetics, diet quality, parasites. And then while we have them in camp, we often put GPS collars on them. And that gives us some really interesting movement data. And I'm going to show how that's useful on this next slide. But we also put VHF collars on them, and that's for monitoring for survival. So if an animal dies and they're not moving, or they're not moving for more than 8 hours, then the GPS collar will either send us an email and let us know, and also the frequency that the radio collar emits. It has a pattern that we can listen to with our radio telemetry, but we can listen to the radio frequency for each individual, and it will tell us based off of its tone whether the animal is alive or dead. And it's important to know that, because if an animal is dead, then we want to get out there as fast as possible and collect the carcass to see what the cause of death was. So was it predation? Was it disease? Was it malnourishment? And that is important information as managers for us to know the health of the population and how they're doing. I'm gonna talk about, we're getting close to wrapping up. Before I go into talking about the data and how we use it, and some really awesome and exciting studies that just came out, does anybody have any questions at the moment about the capture process? Okay, if you think of anything and you want to ask questions, we can also circle back to it at the end of the talk. So just with our last few minutes here, I do want to just share a few different studies that have come out in the last year with some of my collaborators, and drive home why it's important that we collect this data and the type of information that we can get from it. So Danielle Glass used GPS data. And again, this is from the collar. It records their location every 2 hours and sends that data up to satellites. And then we can log on to a website and look it up and see where the sheep is. And then that data as a collective can be used to answer really interesting questions, such as how often are desert bighorn sheep coming in to drink water? We are able to see that bighorn sheep, like I mentioned, we tend to use water in the summertime, which is expected. But what we're finding is that in the wintertime, in these mountain ranges that are experiencing prolonged drought, bighorn sheep are actually visiting water almost as often because they're not able to get the water that they need from the forage that they're eating. Christina's work used GPS data to build movement models. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute with this graphic that we have here and a short little story for you. And then Daniela Decolata and team used GPS data to assess which individuals are more likely to move between mountain ranges and how likely they are to spread disease. So if generally speaking, males are more likely to move between mountain ranges and go on those four-way movements like I was talking about. And using that information, we can build these models like Christina did in this photo here, where you take all the GPS data, and if you look on the image on the left here, so these different colors are simulated utilization distributions. So if it's purple, we basically took all of the GPS data for the Katy Mountain Ranges and put it on a map and looked to see which areas of the mountain range are used the most. And so the purple are the least used and the red are the most used. And what Christina did is she took the data that we had and she trained and used a model to tell the computer, like, hey, the model was able to say, okay, this is the type of habitat that the bighorn sheep really prefer here. Here's the areas that they use the most. And then they were able to look at Interstate 15, which is a major barrier right now. I didn't talk too much about that today because we just didn't have time, but bighorn sheep aren't able to cross it very easily because there's 4 lanes of traffic. But what she was able to do was look at the habitat that they use and simulate what would happen if the interstate didn't exist. And it's really exciting because this data showed that, oh, if the interstate didn't exist, or if we had wildlife overpasses, bighorn sheep would actually utilize a lot of this mountain range and habitat on the northern side, and gives them more options for food to eat and places to lamb, and expand their habitat to then be able to connect more to this other population up here. And so this is exciting because this work has directly played a role in working with California Department of Fish and Wildlife and California Department of Transportation, and this new high-speed train project that's proposed to be built between Los Angeles and Las Vegas along the I-15 corridor, and has been used to help us justify the need for wildlife overpasses in this area if the train is built. So that's real life implications to the data that we're collecting, and being able to increase connectivity, which will hopefully make animals be able to be a little bit more resilient to climate change as well. So this is my last key points for you today. Desert bighorn are very well adapted to live in these extreme desert environments. Climate change is already affecting bighorn across California. Even in the higher elevation mountain ranges. I didn't talk about the Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep today, but they're in much higher elevation mountain ranges and are also being impacted by climate change. So it's important for wildlife managers to continue to monitor their populations, adapt as needed, and continue their collaborations with fellow researchers. And that's a really key piece. This work would not be possible without the support of these different organizations that are here. And here's some of my literature cited, and I just want to thank you all so much for listening, and be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Paige. That was great. We have already a question in the chat, but also people are welcome to raise their hands. But yeah, thank you so much, Paige.
So I'll read you a question in the chat page, and that comes from Frank Bradley, who's with the Envirothon program, and he would like to know, which diseases and parasites are you seeing impact desert bighorns more these days than in the past due to climate change or other reasons?
So the main disease that's been the focus point for a lot of managers across the West in the last decade is called Mycoplasma ovonemoniae. It's a pneumonia that is spread from domestic sheep to wild bighorn. And then once it's in a bighorn system, then it can spread between individuals. It is the main one that we've been monitoring for, but we're also monitoring for different diseases from cattle, and different tick-borne diseases aren't as common. Some of my colleagues are doing studies on parasites at the moment. I can't recall any of the names of them off of my head, but they've actually found that in the desert habitat, parasite load is much less than in other populations of bighorn sheep, like in the Rocky Mountains or in the Sierra. One of the things that is the biggest concern with disease and climate change is the compounding effects, right? So the more stressed the individuals are, the less resilient they are to diseases. And we found that different populations respond to the same type of disease and the same strain of pneumonia differently, kind of like humans do with COVID. And so one of the projects that we're actually working on right now in our big grant through Oregon State University is trying to better understand why different populations have different responses to the same strain of pneumonia.
Thanks, Paige. Does that answer your question, Frank? Okay, well, we have another question from California Envirothon. I think that may be Jovita.
It's the old goat here, or sheep. Yes, I have a question, Paige. I find your presentation fascinating, and I really learned a lot about the climate change impacts on these species. But my question is, it looks as though your research and others have been in coordination with a lot of federal agencies, a lot of federal land management agencies. And I was wondering, excuse me, what cooperation do you have from private landowners? Because we talk about, excuse me, fragmented habitat, or those ranchers who lease land on federal lands like Bureau of Land Management and such, because I know they may be afraid of disease transmission or competition for water. So how is that kind of cooperation partnering working out to be like?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of, I didn't put the map on this presentation, but the majority of the habitat that bighorn sheep reside in California is federal land. The main land management agencies are National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Department of Defense, and some U.S. Forest Service. The private landowners are generally closer to towns and are like in holdings in various areas. In the desert, when I was working for Cal Fish and Wildlife, would interact with them some, but honestly, most of the conversation came between the federal land managing agency and, say, the grazing allotment lease. Our best tools are education and outreach. And so a lot of folks, there's a small town called Newberry Springs outside of Barstow, California. And we'd occasionally see domestic sheep that would get released or run away, or various means of ending up in bighorn sheep habitat. And so trying to just educate the public about the risks that are there. A lot of folks don't know that domestic animals pose threats to wild animals. In the Sierra Nevada, my colleagues have worked a lot more closely with some of the ranchers to either create larger buffers between domestic sheep and where wild sheep could have access. They've worked on relocating or having grazing leases that are not at critical times of the year for like reproduction for bighorn sheep. It can be complicated, but trying to just maintain those good relationships and have education materials available for folks that they know is kind of our best tools. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I've had the experience of working with U.S. Forest Service and ranchers that graze their cattle on public lands, and I kind of know how complicated it can be. So thank you.
Yeah.
We have another question in the chat page from Steve Engelman. He would like to know, are there any efforts to minimize interaction between domestic sheep and bighorn? And that just reminds me, sorry to jump in on this, but I think when we were first becoming acquainted, there was an incident at my old employer where 2 domestic sheep had broken away from someone's farm, run onto the installation, we had to catch it, and we didn't really know what to do or how to should we worry about that in relation to bighorn sheep. And we had an interesting conversation about the things you wanted to know about the domestic sheep, which we ended up turning over to animal control. So how would we, sorry to interrupt with that, but are there efforts to minimize the interaction between domestic sheep and bighorn sheep, and what are the concerns, or what are the main concerns with their interactions?
Yeah, and I see, Steve, that you just put that in the chat, that I've answered it to some degree for you, but yeah, it really depends on the location and what the situation is. So in the desert, we don't have as many domestic grazing allotments for sheep, and so in fact, we actually don't have any that are active and overlap. And so most of our concerns around hobby farms. And that's where the education outreach comes in. But there have been studies that have looked at, what are the appropriate distances and ways to separate animals, and can you double fence or have them on grazing allotments during certain times of the year that are less likely to bring in interested rams on a foray movement, for example. But if you have any other questions related to that, feel free to ask. If it's possible, and if you have a question, I'll answer it in just a second. If students or folks in general are able to use the hand raise, I'm just curious how many folks have seen desert bighorn sheep before, or bighorn sheep in general. Got a couple. Okay. Yeah, they can be pretty hard to see. I've often spent many hours staring at a mountainside knowing that the animal was there and still not being able to find them. Anna, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I was wondering how the bighorn sheep or the desert bighorn sheep populations have changed in recent years, and if you have an estimate on how many desert bighorn sheep there are right now, what their population size is about.
Yeah, so in California, because there's like I said, over 50 mountain ranges, and our team of researchers, while I was still with the department, there's like 4 or 5 of us. It's really hard to survey all of the mountain ranges, and so our estimate for California is 3,000 to 5,000, which are pretty big confidence intervals, but there's a lot of variation in there can be a lot of variation in population size. Overall, I often am asked, like, how are bighorn sheep doing in California, or desert bighorn sheep specifically, the non-endangered ones. Overall, their populations are doing pretty well. And there's some that are continuing to increase. There's some that are decreasing. There's some that are stable. There's some that will increase and then decrease. But the overall trends are they're doing well. They're not on the brink of becoming endangered. That said, there is also trends with recent droughts and recent disease, and by recent I mean in the last like 10 years, where certain populations have had low lamb survival for long enough that we're starting to see the overall population trend down. It's not current cause for major concern, but it is just something that is continuing to be monitored, and efforts such as water management, a lot of money goes towards that, and just trying to figure out, what are ways to help these populations be more resilient in the face of climate change.
Thank you.
The pictures of bighorn foraging on golf courses. I'm gonna guess that those photos were from Palm Springs area. Yeah, and that is an issue. It's a complicated one. My colleagues, those are the peninsular bighorn sheep. And so I wasn't personally engaged in those conversations. But there's a couple challenging different factors. Bighorn sheep, you can't really, you don't want to subsidize food. Or you can't really subsidize food for bighorn sheep in the same way you could add water. Having the animals on the golf courses have had issues. There's been concerns about pesticide use in the golf courses, I think was one of the main health concerns. Also just having these animals become reliant on being able to come down and forage on these beautiful green golf courses, which look much more appealing than their harsh desert environments, but is not the type of food that they're naturally supposed to be eating. So there's been various conversations about how to mitigate that and work with that. But yeah, I think maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
This is Jovita. I have a quick question. I'm sorry not to raise my hand, but with all this collaboration of all the different agencies, federal and state, where do you get the funding to do this kind of research and monitoring? How do you guys access funds?
Yeah, so for the program that I was running, a large portion of our funds come through the Pittman-Robertson grant. And PR funding is funding that comes from tax dollars on any hunting related purchase. So when the general public buys anything related to hunting, there's an additional tax on it. And that tax is a federal tax that goes into a pot, and then that money is used for managing wildlife across the entire US. And so each state applies each year for a portion of that pot of funding, and based of what their management needs are and overall cost, they get allotted PR money. It is meant to be used for game managed animals, which means animals that are hunted. I didn't go into that too much in this talk, but the desert bighorn sheep are hunted in California. It is a relatively small, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to get a bighorn sheep tag. There's generally 20 to 30 tags available per year, which for the Western states is one of the most conservative hunting programs for bighorn sheep. And so a good portion of our funding comes from federal funding. I'd say about 75%. 25% of that is then matched with state funding. That money comes from actually fundraising tags from hunters. So every year there's one bighorn sheep tag that is sold to the highest bidder. And there's one, the other 2 or 3 vary depending on how many tags they've been allotted for the whole state. But fundraising for hunting opportunities brings in a lot of money. And then collaborating with fellow researchers. So Oregon State has been a key collaborator over the last 10 years, and most of their funding comes from the National Science Foundation. We're currently working on a grant right now that is Science Foundation funded, and by working with the collaborators, California Department of Fish and Wildlife will pay for like helicopter captures, but Oregon State will pay for collars, or Oregon State will help pay for some of the disease testing or provide people to come out and help us do data collection. So it varies a bit. some of the different federal agencies have also provided funding over the years. So when Alimo is working at 29 Palms Marine Base, they bought collars for us, or for bighorn sheep. So it kind of it varies a bit of figuring out the different pieces to make it work.
Wow, it's pretty complex, I'd say, but coordinated.
Yes.
Thank you.
There's a lot. Yeah, my job with Cal Fish and Wildlife was mostly coordinating between land access and permits and the number of people and phone calls that need to be made for doing helicopter surveys or helicopter captures, tracking disease. It's a big team effort.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Feel free to write them in the chat or raise your hand. I feel like I learned a lot today about desert bighorn sheep, about their biology, how they're impacted by climate change, about research going on. I think I'll be looking back at the slides again because, yeah, there was so much great information.
Well, thank you
Thanks
so
for
much for
mentioning
having me. I
that.
appreciate it.
Just so folks know, in the chat, we did put the slides in a little bit earlier, so you can download those if you haven't seen them already and just have them to switch through. There's also going to be a video link posted on the website when we finish up. Well,
On behalf of Envirothon, I want to thank Paige for taking time on her Saturday to present to our Envirothon teams. And I want to thank all the students and Steve for you all being here as well. And we look forward to seeing you. We have another webinar at 2 o'clock this afternoon on the Pacific Flyway and how climate is affecting the migration of waterfowl throughout the state. So again, this was a great learning experience for me on bighorn sheep. So thank you all.